Friends wasn't just a sitcom, it was a global phenomenon that defined an entire generation. For 10 seasons, millions of viewers tuned in to watch the lives of 6 friends unfold in New York City. But when the show ended in 2004, fans were left heartbroken and wondering why it had to come to a close. Now, the real reasons behind the decision to end Friends after 10 seasons are finally being revealed, and they're more personal and complicated than most people ever knew. A show came along that changed television forever. Friends, the iconic sitcom about 6 20-somethings living in New York City, became a cultural phenomenon. It ran for 10 seasons, May 6, 2004, with 236 episodes that millions of fans still binge-watch today. The show's mix of humor, heart, and relatable characters made it a staple of American television, and its influence is still felt in sitcoms that followed. But after a decade of success, why did Friends end? Was it just a natural conclusion, or were there deeper reasons behind the decision to wrap up the show? Let's dive into the real reasons why Friends ended after 10 seasons, exploring the creative, financial, personal, and cultural factors that led to its finale. First, let's set the stage by looking at what Friends was and why it mattered. Created by David Crane and Marta Kauffman, Friends followed the lives of Ross Geller, Rachel Green, Monica Geller, Chandler Bing, Joey Tribbiani, and Phoebe Buffay. These characters, played by David Schwimmer, Jennifer Aniston, Courtney Cox, Matthew Perry, Matt LeBlanc, and Lisa Kudrow, respectively, became household names. The show captured the struggles and joys of young adulthood friendships, relationships, careers, and the search for meaning, all set against the backdrop of a cozy New York apartment and a coffee shop called Central Perk. By the time the show ended, it was averaging around 23 million viewers per episode in the US alone, according to Nielsen ratings, and it had won multiple Emmy Awards, including Outstanding Comedy Series in 2002. So, with all that success, why would a show at the peak of its popularity call it quits? One of the biggest reasons often cited is the natural arc of the storylines. By season 10, the characters had grown significantly. Ross and Rachel, whose on-again, off-again romance was a central plotline, had a daughter named Emma. Monica and Chandler, once the sarcastic friend and the neurotic chef, were married and planning to adopt a child. Phoebe had found love with Mike Hannigan, played by Paul Rudd, and Joey, well, Joey was still Joey, but even he had matured in his own way. The show's creators felt that the characters' stories were reaching a point where major life, milestones, marriage, parenthood, career stability were wrapping up. In a 2004 interview with Entertainment Weekly, Marta Kauffman said, "We didn't want to get to the point where the characters were unrecognizable or the stories felt forced. We wanted to end while people still loved it." This idea of ending on a high note was critical. Many television shows, especially sitcoms, face the risk of jumping the shark, a term used when a show starts to decline in quality because it's run out of fresh ideas. Friends had already dodged this bullet a few times. For example, some fans criticized the Ross-Rachel-Emily love triangle in season 4, or Joey's crush on Rachel in seasons 8 and 9, as stretching the show's believability. By season 10, the writers were aware that keeping the group in the same dynamic hanging out at Central Perk, dealing with dating drama, might start to feel stale. The characters were in their mid-32nd by the end, and their lives were moving toward more adult responsibilities. Continuing the show could have meant forcing unrealistic plots, like keeping them single and aimless forever, which wouldn't align with their growth. Another key factor was the cast's personal and professional desires. By 2004, all 6 actors were major stars. Jennifer Aniston, in particular, was becoming a Hollywood heavyweight, with roles in films like Bruce Almighty, 2003, and Along Came Polly, 2004. David Schwimmer had directed episodes of Friends and was pursuing other projects, including theater. Matthew Perry, Courtney Cox, Matt LeBlanc, and Lisa Kudrow were also exploring opportunities outside the show. In a 2004 Oprah Winfrey interview, the cast discussed how the show's intense schedule, filming 24 episodes a season, plus rehearsals and press, left little time for other pursuits. The actors were ready to move on, not because they didn't love Friends, but because they wanted to grow as artists and individuals. Money also played a huge role. By the final seasons, Friends was one of the most expensive shows on television. Each of the 6 main actors was earning $1 million per episode in seasons 9 and 10, according to reports from Variety and The Hollywood Reporter. This was a massive jump from their starting salaries of about $22,500 per episode in season 1. The show's production budget, including sets, writers, and crew, was also sky high. NBC was willing to pay because Friends was a ratings juggernaut, but the costs were becoming unsustainable. In a 2002 interview with the New York Times, NBC executive Jeff Zucker admitted that the network was losing money on Friends despite its popularity because of the skyrocketing salaries. For Warner Brothers, the show's production company, the financial equation was shifting too. While syndication deals were lucrative, Friends still earns hundreds of millions annually in reruns. The cost of producing new episodes was starting to outweigh the immediate profits. The network and producers also faced pressure to keep the show fresh while competing in a changing television landscape. By the early 2000s, reality television was booming. Shows like Survivor, premiered 2000, and American Idol, premiered 2002, were drawing huge audiences with lower production costs. Sitcoms, meanwhile, were losing ground. According to Nielsen data, the top-rated scripted shows in 2003 to 2004 were still strong, but reality television was starting to dominate. Friends remained a powerhouse, but NBC knew it couldn't rely on one show forever. The network was already developing new sitcoms, like Scrubs and Will and Grace, to fill the void. Ending Friends allowed NBC to focus resources on fresh projects while letting the show exit gracefully. Behind the scenes, there were also logistical challenges. The writers' room was struggling to come up with new stories after a decade. In a 2019 interview on the Origins podcast, writer-producer David Crane explained that by season 10, the team felt they'd explored nearly every possible dynamic among the characters. Romantic pairings, breakups, job changes, and personal growth had all been covered extensively. The writers didn't want to recycle old plots or introduce gimmicks that would dilute the show's legacy. For example, they avoided major character deaths or drastic changes to the group dynamic, which could have alienated fans. Instead, they focused on tying up loose ends, like Ross and Rachel's relationship and Monica and Chandler's adoption. The decision to end Friends wasn't made overnight. It was a gradual process involving negotiations among the cast, creators, and NBC. Initially, the show was renewed season by season, with uncertainty about how long it would last. By season 8, after the 11th of September 2001 attacks, the show's themes of friendship and comfort resonated even more with audiences, boosting its ratings. This led to a 2-season renewal for seasons 9 and 10, but with the understanding that 10 would likely be the last. In a 2003 press release, NBC confirmed that season 10 would be the final one, giving the writers time to craft a proper ending. The cast and crew agreed that 10 seasons felt like a natural milestone, long enough to tell a complete story, but not so long that the show overstayed its welcome. Let's talk about the fans' role in all this. Friends had a massive, loyal audience, and their expectations shaped the show's trajectory. Fans were invested in the characters' happy endings, especially Ross and Rachel's romance. The writers knew they couldn't drag out the will they won't they dynamic forever without frustrating viewers. In the season 10 finale, the last one, Ross and Rachel finally got together for good, with Ross's iconic line, "I got off the plane," becoming one of the most quoted moments in television history. The episode drew 52.5 million viewers in the US, according to Nielsen, making it one of the most watched finales ever. The creators wanted to deliver closure that satisfied fans while staying true to the show's heart. Prolonging the series might have risked disappointing this passionate audience. Another factor was the cultural moment. By 2004, the world was different from when Friends premiered. The internet was changing how people consumed media, with streaming services like Netflix just starting to emerge. Netflix launched its streaming platform in 2007, but its DVD service was already popular by 2004. Social attitudes were shifting too. Friends faced some criticism over the years for its lack of diversity, and dated portrayals of certain issues, like gender and sexuality. While the show was progressive for its time tackling topics like adoption and same-sex marriage, it was also a product of the 1990. Continuing the show might have required addressing these critiques head-on, which could have changed its light-hearted tone. The creators chose to end it before it had to reinvent itself too drastically. The cast's chemistry was another consideration. The 6 actors had an almost magical rapport, both on and off screen. In the 2021 HBO Max special Friends, The Reunion, they talked about how close they became over the years, almost like a real family. But that closeness also meant they felt the emotional weight of continuing. Lisa Kudrow mentioned in The Reunion that by season 10, saying goodbye to the characters was heartbreaking but necessary. The actors didn't want to risk growing tired of the roles or losing the spark that made their performances special. Ending the show preserved that legacy. Let's not forget the business side of television. Friends was produced by Bright, Kaufman, Crane Productions, in association with Warner Brothers Television. By the time the show ended, Warner Brothers was already banking on syndication and international sales. Friends was a global hit, airing in over 100 countries. According to a 2018 report by The Hollywood Reporter, the show generates about $1 billion annually for Warner Brothers through syndication and streaming deals. Ending the show in 2004 didn't mean the end of its profitability. It ensured that the episodes remained timeless, avoiding the risk of later seasons tarnishing the brand. The creative team also wanted to avoid the pitfalls of other long-running shows. Take The Simpsons, which by 2004 was in its 15th season and facing criticism for declining quality. Or ER, another NBC hit, which ran for 15 seasons but struggled to maintain its early magic after key cast members left. Friends creators looked at these examples and decided to prioritize quality over quantity. In a 2004 interview with the Los Angeles Times, David Crane said, "We'd rather go out strong than limp along. 10 years is a good run." Now, let's explore the finale itself, because it tells us a lot about why the show ended. The final episode was carefully crafted to give closure to each character. Monica and Chandler welcomed their adopted twins, moving to the suburbs to start a new chapter. Ross and Rachel reconciled, fulfilling a decade-long arc. Phoebe was happily married to Mike, and Joey got a spin-off, Joey, which premiered in 2004 but only lasted 2 seasons. The final scene, where the group leaves Monica's apartment and places their keys on the counter, was a symbolic goodbye. The empty apartment, with its iconic purple walls, was a visual reminder that this chapter was over. Fans cried, the cast cried, and even the crew admitted it was an emotional shoot. But could Friends have continued? Some argue it could have. The ratings were still strong, with season 10 averaging 22.8 million viewers per episode, per Nielsen. The fanbase was global, and the show's formula ensemble comedy with relatable humor was timeless. A few cast members, like Matt LeBlanc, were reportedly open to continuing, according to a 2003 Entertainment Weekly article. But the consensus among the creators, and most of the cast, was that the story had reached its natural end. Stretching it further risked diluting what made Friends special. Another angle to consider is the show's impact on the actors' lives. By 2004, they weren't just actors, they were global celebrities. Paparazzi followed their every move, and tabloids speculated about their personal lives, especially Jennifer Aniston's marriage to Brad Pitt. The pressure of fame was intense, and continuing the show would have meant more years under that spotlight. In Friends, The Reunion, Courtney Cox talked about how the cast leaned on each other to cope with the craziness of stardom. Ending the show gave them a chance to step back and reclaim some normalcy. The writers also faced the challenge of keeping the humor fresh. Friends was known for its sharp dialogue and physical comedy. Think Ross's pivot moment or Chandler's sarcastic one-liners. But after 236 episodes, coming up with new jokes was tough. The writers' room had to balance nostalgia with innovation, and by season 10, they were leaning heavily on resolving long-running arcs rather than introducing new ones. This was evident in episodes like the one with Ross's tan or the one where Joey speaks French, which were funny but relied on familiar character quirks. Continuing the show might have meant more filler episodes, which could have weakened its reputation. The network's scheduling strategy also played a part. Friends aired on NBC's must-see television Thursday night lineup, alongside shows like Seinfeld and ER. By 2004, that lineup was losing its dominance as cable and reality television grew. NBC was shifting its focus, and ending Friends allowed the network to reallocate its budget and marketing to new shows. The spin-off Joey was an attempt to keep the Friends universe alive, but its failure showed how hard it was to replicate the original's magic. Let's talk about the cultural legacy of Friends, because it's tied to why ending it made sense. The show defined an era of television where ensemble comedies ruled. It influenced shows like How I Met Your Mother, The Big Bang Theory, and New Girl, which borrowed its group dynamic formula. But by 2004, television was evolving. Dramas like The Sopranos and Lost were gaining traction, offering serialized storytelling that sitcoms couldn't match. Friends' episodic format, while comforting, was starting to feel old school. Ending the show allowed it to remain a time capsule of the 1990 and early 2000s, rather than trying to compete in a new television era. The decision to end Friends wasn't just about the show itself, it was about preserving its place in history. The creators wanted it to be remembered as a classic, not a show that overstayed its welcome. In a 2004 interview with the Chicago Tribune, Marta Kaufman said, "We wanted to give fans an ending they'd cherish, not one they'd resent." The finale delivered on that promise, with emotional moments like Chandler and Monica's twins and Ross chasing Rachel to the airport. It was a love letter to the fans, tying up the storylines in a way that felt satisfying. Of course, the end of Friends didn't mean the end of its influence. The show's syndication success proved its staying power. By 2011, it was airing on networks like TBS and Nickelodeon's Nick at Night, reaching new generations. When streaming took off, Friends found a massive audience on Netflix, where it was one of the platform's most watched shows from 2015 to 2019. According to a 2019 Nielsen report, viewers streamed Friends for 54.3 billion minutes that year in the US alone. Its move to HBO Max, now Max, in 2020, along with the reunion special, showed that the show's appeal was timeless. Ending it in 2004 ensured that it remained a cultural touchstone, not a relic that faded away. But what about the what-ifs? Could Friends have tackled new themes or introduced new characters to keep going? Some fans point to shows like Modern Family, which ran for 11 seasons by blending new and old characters. But Friends was built on the chemistry of its core 6, and adding new leads might have disrupted that balance. The spin-off Joey tried to expand the universe but struggled without the ensemble dynamic. Plus, the show's setting New York City, 1990, was part of its charm. Moving the characters to new locations or life stages, like Parenthood or Suburbia, could have changed the vibe too much. The actors' contracts also played a role. By season 10, the cast had negotiated as a unit, ensuring they all earned the same $1 million per episode. This unity was rare in Hollywood and gave them leverage, but it also meant that if one actor wanted out, it could disrupt the whole show. According to a 2004 Variety article, David Schwimmer was one of the first to push for ending the show, feeling that Ross's story had reached a natural conclusion. The others eventually agreed, prioritizing the group's legacy over individual desires to continue. The production side had its own challenges. Filming Friends was a massive undertaking, with elaborate sets like Monica's apartment and Central Perk requiring constant maintenance. The live studio audience, a hallmark of the show, added energy but also complexity, as scenes had to be rehearsed and shot multiple times. By season 10, the crew was exhausted, and the creative team was running out of steam. In a 2004 behind-the-scenes documentary, producer Kevin S. Bright admitted that the finale was bittersweet because the team knew they'd never recreate that magic again. Fans sometimes wonder if external pressures, like network politics or studio decisions, forced the show to end. While NBC and Warner Brothers had financial concerns, the decision was largely driven by the creators and cast. In a 2003 interview with The Washington Post, Jeff Zucker emphasized that NBC would have loved to keep Friends going, but respected the creative team's choice to end it. This wasn't a case of a network pulling the plug, it was a collaborative decision to go out on top. The global impact of Friends also influenced the decision. By 2004, the show was a phenomenon in countries like the UK, Australia, and India, where fans related to its universal themes of friendship and love. Ending the show ensured that it remained a global export, with episodes that could be enjoyed without needing to follow a long, ongoing storyline. This accessibility helped Friends become a staple in international markets, where it still airs on local networks and streaming platforms. Let's not ignore the emotional toll on everyone involved. The cast and crew spent a decade together, forming bonds that went beyond the screen. In Friends, the reunion, Matt LeBlanc shared how the final table read was so emotional that they could barely get through it. The actors knew they were saying goodbye not just to their characters, but to a chapter of their lives. Continuing the show might have strained those bonds, especially if some actors were ready to move on while others weren't. The show's humor also had to evolve with the times. Friends was a product of the 1990s, with jokes that sometimes leaned on stereotypes or dated references. By 2004, cultural sensitivity was becoming a bigger conversation in media. The writers were aware that some of the show's humor, like Chandler's discomfort with his transgender parent or fat-shaming jokes about Monica's past, might not age well. Ending the show allowed it to remain a snapshot of its era, rather than forcing it to navigate a new cultural landscape. Yet, even with all these factors, the decision to end Friends wasn't simple. Negotiations between the network, the production team, and the cast had been tense during the last few seasons. Each of the 6 main actors had reached a level of fame and bargaining power that few television stars ever achieve. By the time the final season was greenlit, the cast was earning a record-breaking $1 million per episode, a number that became legendary in Hollywood circles. While the actors deserved every cent given their contribution to the show's success, the economics of continuing became increasingly complex. The network had to consider not only salaries but also the cost of production, set maintenance, and marketing. Despite the financial strain, NBC was still eager to keep the show alive because Friends was a massive revenue generator. But ultimately, money wasn't the deciding factor. The creative exhaustion and the desire to end on a high note carried more weight. Another layer to the decision was the personal growth of the actors. Jennifer Aniston, for example, had started building a successful film career and was becoming a household name beyond her role as Rachel Green. Courtney Cox was eager to explore new roles, and Lisa Kudrow had other projects lined up as well. Matt LeBlanc and Matthew Perry both had ambitions to lead new shows, while David Schwimmer was increasingly drawn to directing. These individual goals made it harder to align everyone's schedules and priorities. Keeping the group together indefinitely would have required enormous compromises from each cast member, and there was a shared understanding that their time as an ensemble was reaching its natural conclusion. The writing team also faced creative burnout. Maintaining the show's tone, humor, and narrative momentum after 10 seasons is no small feat. The writers had to continuously find new storylines while keeping the characters relatable and fresh. There was a risk that dragging the show beyond its natural lifespan could lead to recycled plots or forced drama. Ending the show when they did helped preserve its integrity. It allowed Friends to avoid the fate of some other long-running shows that overstayed their welcome and ended on a whimper rather than a bang. On top of all that, there was the matter of legacy. The creators David Crane, Marta Kaufman, and Kevin S. Bright were deeply aware of the importance of timing. They wanted Friends to be remembered as a show that left audiences wanting more, not one that hung around past its prime. By choosing to end it when they did, they cemented its status as a cultural touchstone rather than letting it fade into irrelevance. They knew the show had already achieved a kind of immortality, and prolonging it might actually dilute its impact. The final season, though still widely watched, carried an air of inevitability. Fans tuned in not just for the laughs, but to witness the conclusion of a shared experience that had lasted a decade. The final episode, watched by over 52 million Americans, was more than just a television event, it was a cultural moment. People gathered at viewing parties, friends reunited to say goodbye to friends, and media outlets covered the finale as though it were a national milestone. The closing scene, with the 6 friends leaving Monica's apartment for the last time, captured the bittersweet reality of growing up, moving on, and letting go. In the years since the finale aired, Friends has only grown in popularity. Streaming services like Netflix and Max have introduced the series to new generations, and it continues to be one of the most watched shows on those platforms. The characters of Ross, Rachel, Monica, Chandler, Joey, and Phoebe remain iconic, their quirks and relationships resonating with viewers decades after the final curtain closed. Merchandise, reruns, and memes keep the show alive in popular culture, proving that ending Friends when they did was perhaps the best decision for its long-term legacy. Even now, fans speculate about whether the show could ever return for a full reboot or sequel. But the creators and cast have mostly resisted that temptation, recognizing that any attempt to revive the series could risk tarnishing what they built. The 2021 Friends, the reunion special, offered a compromise, a chance to celebrate the show without reopening old storylines or trying to force a continuation. It allowed the cast and fans alike to reflect, reminisce, and acknowledge the emotional weight of what Friends meant, both personally and culturally. Friends wasn't just a sitcom, it became a global phenomenon, a shared language for people around the world. Its decision to end in 2004 wasn't about failure or cancellation, it was about knowing when to step away gracefully. The show managed to capture a moment in time, reflecting the lives of young adults navigating love, work, and friendship in New York City. Its themes were timeless, but its execution was uniquely suited to the era in which it was made. By closing the chapter when they did, the creators ensured that Friends would remain forever relevant, a lasting portrait of 6 people who, for 10 years, made the world laugh, cry, and feel a little less alone. Another angle is the show's impact on pop culture. Friends gave us catchphrases like, "How you doing?" and "We were on a break," that are still quoted today. It popularized the coffee shop hangout, inspired fashion trends, Rachel's haircut, anyone, and even influenced how people talked about relationships. By ending in 2004, Friends cemented its place as a cultural artifact, rather than risking irrelevance by trying to chase new trends. The finale's success also validated the decision to end. The double-length episode was a ratings smash and a critical hit, with outlets like the New York Times praising its emotional resonance. It gave fans what they wanted: closure, while leaving just enough open-ended to spark imagination. Would Ross and Rachel stay together? How would Monica and Chandler adjust to parenthood? These questions kept fans engaged without needing more episodes. In the years since, the cast and creators have stood by the decision. In Friends, the reunion, David Schwimmer said, "We knew it was time. We didn't want to be the show that people watched out of habit." The reunion itself, which brought the cast together to reminisce, showed how much the show still meant to them and to fans. It wasn't about reviving Friends, but celebrating its legacy. Looking back, the reasons Friends ended are interconnected. The characters' stories had reached natural conclusions, the cast was ready for new challenges, and the financial and creative costs were mounting. The cultural landscape was shifting, and the creators wanted to preserve the show's legacy. By ending after 10 seasons, Friends avoided the fate of shows that linger too long, losing their spark. Instead, it went out as a beloved classic, still cherished by millions. The end of Friends wasn't just about contracts or ratings, it was about timing, personal growth, and the desire to leave on a high note. For the cast and creators, saying goodbye wasn't easy, but it was a choice made with care, and while the show may have ended, its legacy continues, proving that some friendships really are forever.